Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, does Trump's return make meaningful action on climate change impossible?
I'm immediately withdrawing from the unfair, one-sided Paris Climate Accord ripoff.
One climate activist's advice on how to manage your anxiety and get back in the fight. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
I grew up in a coastal fishing village in the north of Hong Kong, and we were extremely prone to typhoons every summer. And I remember the times that these typhoons would prevent me from going to school, and I was a very keen being. I was a massive teacher's pet. I loved going to school, and it would distress me so much. And I think that that almost manifested as this special interest of mine. So I was relentlessly campaigning for environmental causes throughout my childhood. My name is Tori Tsui. I am a climate justice activist and senior advisor for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I am dialing in from London.
All right. Well, Tori, welcome to The Take. It's been a week now since Trump took office. And out of the dizzying number of executive orders and proclamations that he has signed, the one we're going to focus on is the order to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement for the second time. Now, just a quick background on that. The Paris Accord was signed by 196 nations with the goal of keeping global temperatures from exceeding a threshold of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which at one point was considered a critical tipping point. So to start off, let me get your big picture reaction to this move, and what are the implications of the U.S. pulling out of this agreement?
Yeah, well, I think it's really fascinating for me because it's déjà vu. I know this all too well, as he pulled out the last time he was in office. Now, the Paris Agreement, as you mentioned, set out this benchmark of 1.5 degrees, which is considered the so-called safe level of warming above, pre-industrial times. And the reality is it's not very safe at all, as we're seeing all across the world. We've had flash floods here in the UK and Wales, and as you've seen, the devastation in Los Angeles with the wildfires. The thing that is quite concerning is that the US is the second biggest carbon emitter after China, and sets the precedent, I think, for a lot of global superpowers to adhere to their climate targets. So when a big superpower like the US pulls out of a climate agreement like Paris, it really does mean that the North Star has become somewhat lost here. It means that a lot of other countries are more susceptible to not adhere to those targets as well. And in the Biden administration, they set out to determine what we call nationally determined contributions. And those are effectively ways in which countries will scale back their carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And under Trump, those are effectively null. They're nullified now. They don't exist. And so there's no obligation for the US to actually scale back on fossil fuel production. And quite the opposite of we've seen with Trump, him talking about drill, baby, drill. This is quite frankly devastating for climate action and is a scary time, to say the least, as a climate campaign, even for citizens all around the world.
Yeah. So Trump has been arguing since 2017 that the Paris Climate Agreement undermines U.S. industries while allowing other countries, China in particular, to pollute without consequence.
The United States will not sabotage our own industries while China pollutes with impunity. China, look, they use a lot of dirty energy, but they produce a lot of energy. And when that stuff goes up in the air, it doesn't stay there.
He's basically saying the U.S. can't lead on this issue because others might take advantage. Does that line of argument hold water to you?
Well, it's quite interesting because China is often used as the comparison here. And I do like to caveat that while China is technically the world's biggest carbon emitter at the moment, per capita, it's actually a lot lower than other countries. And we also have to recognize that China does the majority of manufacturing for the global north. So there are a few things that need to be taken into consideration. They're also expanding renewable energy and green infrastructure far faster than any other global superpower. I mean, it's actually really impressive.
China has more than doubled construction of new wind and solar plants over the past year.
Chinese President Xi Jinping had announced that the country aims to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060.
Yes, they still have ties to coal, which is one of the most polluting forms of fossil fuels, but we have to also commend them on the progress that they're making for the green transition. I think something we also need to remember is that, okay, while, yes, we have these big polluters, pollution in and of itself doesn't discriminate in terms of geographical borders. This is something that affects us all. And I think to turn it into a bit of a tit for tat and a competition, as it were, is really detracting from the fact that this is a global crisis, which will have consequences on people even within the US, as we've seen. And I think for the Trump presidency and Donald Trump to deny the reality that regardless of what his stance is on climate and, who's producing more emissions and who's more responsible, this is going to affect the citizens of the nation that he's the president of. And so it would be completely irresponsible to ignore the responsibility that he has towards the nation and to the global north and south as well.
Yeah. I mean, Trump and his allies tend to focus on the cost of complying.
The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending and escalating energy prices, and that is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
But what about the cost of not doing anything?
Well, with the Los Angeles fires, that's estimated to have cost upwards of $50 billion in damage.
Fires earlier this month took dozens of lives and obliterated whole neighborhoods in Los Angeles, leaving tens of thousands without homes.
And that is only expected to grow as we see more and more what I call unnatural disasters take place. So for me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. The cost of not taking action is going to be far greater than the cost of taking action. And the sooner we start implementing these changes, the less costly it's going to be.
You have talked in the past about Palestine being a climate justice issue. Now, those might sound like separate issues, but you don't think so.
Well, if we're going to start with the topic that we were just talking about, money.
US President Joe Biden is proposing an $8 billion arms deal with Israel.
And I think that it would be remiss to say that that in and of itself is not a climate issue, because that's money that could be funneled into creating green jobs, transitioning towards a green economy, providing green infrastructure for people and their livelihoods. But then there's also the fact that in the first 2 months of 2023, the Israeli military emitted more carbon through bombing Gaza than 33 countries combined. It's effectively a climate bomb. And then we also have to take into account that the US military is the single biggest industrial carbon emitter. Yet when it comes to climate frameworks, when it comes to the sort of mainstream conversations around climate, it's very conveniently left out of the discourse. And that is just on the basis of talking about carbon and finance. Climate justice, however, understands the implications of systemic oppression on people and their livelihoods. I mean, just bearing witness to what's happening in Gaza is absolutely horrific. And so we need to understand the sort of interconnectedness of how the military-industrial complex, colonization, and also the extraction of resources intersects. There's also a huge sort of connection between certain pipelines that supply Israel's military, specifically running through Azerbaijan. There's also a large conversation that's taking place about offshore oil and gas off the coast of Israel. There are issues to do with water apartheid, where water is being siphoned off from Palestine to Israeli homes. And we also have to talk about the fact that there's a lot of greenwashing that Israel is doing by planting non-native European pine trees on indigenous Palestinian land, which is not suitable for the climate. And it is a form of what we call carbon offsetting. They say they plant these trees to offset their carbon, but in reality, these trees don't necessarily thrive in these ecosystems. So all of these things combined paint to me that what's happening in Palestine is a climate injustice. And I think the environmental movement has gotten to a point now where we are recognizing that in order to advocate for climate justice, we also need to advocate for a free Palestine.
What's the state of the Paris Climate Agreement? I mean, I know we've already surpassed the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold once in 2024. Has the world just given up on this? Is Paris a dead letter?
We have this sort of motto in the climate movement to keep 1.5 alive. And as you've rightly so pointed out, it does feel like we're not reaching that target. In fact, last year, 2024, was the hottest year on record and the first time that we surpassed 1.5 degrees of warming. So, in that regard, yes, one might say that Paris is failing. What's really interesting for me is that I work with an organization called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to be a complementary agreement to the Paris Agreement. And the reason for this is that, funnily enough, the Paris Agreement fails to mention coal, oil, and gas, which are the leading cause of climate change. These fossil fuel products accounted for 86% of all carbon emissions over the last decade, and yet our very own UNFCCC framework doesn't mention them at all. And that is not an accident. You see, the fossil fuel industry has a long history of burying the science. In the 1970s, Exxon knew about the science. In fact, we're some of the most scientifically literate people to know what was happening to the climate, yet they buried it. So for me, of course, I am slightly skeptical of the power of the Paris Agreement if it fails to tackle these, the matter at the crux. But at the same time, it's what's on the table, and it's something that, is perhaps more achievable for a lot of nations who are a little bit hesitant about reducing their fossil fuel emissions. And so to have the US pull out of something where the bar is already quite low is quite sad, really.
That the bar is quite low. And it sounds like you're saying we need a new framework. I mean, the last two climate change conferences were in the UAE and Azerbaijan, right?
Yeah.
Those are oil-producing nations. So you wonder how seriously we're taking this. More with Tori after a break. So, Tori, Trump's comeback is happening against the backdrop of an increasingly dire climate situation. 2024 was the hottest year on record, with 2025 continuing that trend. It seems like each year we have more frequent, more intense heat waves, floods, extreme weather events. We've talked about that a little bit. The LA wildfires, where I'm in LA right now. I mean, I'm seeing that firsthand. People still watch the news, right? People know that things are bad now, but maybe haven't internalized how much worse it could get. So I'm asking you, how much worse could this get?
That's a scary question, but one that we need to address, in part because things are going to get worse. And I say this as a realist. I'm someone who is very practical when it comes to climate action and understanding the science and what's at stake. And I think something that I really try to stress is that change is coming, whether we like it or not. So we need to adapt and we need to mitigate. Every fraction of a degree matters. Every single ton of carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere is the difference between an ecosystem collapsing or a life being lost. So for me, it's about preserving what we can save. And the reality is that with 1.5 degrees, we're already seeing wildfires, floods, storms. We have a storm up north in the UK, which is one of the strongest in ever recorded history, and people are having to adapt in new ways. Yeah. It is terrifying, but it is something that we also need to prepare for because our governments aren't acting in a way that we want them to. There is still time to prevent the worst of it. But with current trajectories, we're on track to nearly 3 degrees of warming. That spells out complete ecosystem collapse and the collapse of civilizations as we know it. I think
that's a different planet.
Yeah.
Fundamentally different planet than
Absolutely.
has existed in the whole breadth of human civilization.
Absolutely. And it's a very delicate situation because you don't want to be painted as a doomist, but you also don't want to skirt around the realities, the science.
Well, you have to both frighten people enough to care, but also then not frighten them so much that they become paralyzed.
It is such a fine line as well. And I'd be lying if I said that I didn't sometimes fall to despair. There are times where I literally have to turn everything off and not look at the news, which for a long time I thought, you know what, as a public figure, as a climate campaigner, I have an obligation to bear witness to every news article out there. And then I realized that was actually hindering my capacity to act. And so I kind of went, You know what, I can only do what I can do. And I think it's also, it's challenging as well, the human ego, to feel like we have to shoulder everything instead of sharing that responsibility.
Yeah. So Tori, you said our governments aren't reacting to the problem. And yet we see voters around the world that just keep electing politicians who are either hostile or at least lukewarm to addressing climate change. Even young people who are going to face the direct effects of what we're describing. Why isn't this issue resonating? Why isn't it top of mind?
So if we look at, for instance, the European elections last year, we saw the rise of the German far right. A lot of the voters came from a young cohort, which is far cry from the way that we present young people, more progressive, more concerned about the climate. And what was really fascinating about this is that it wasn't that young people weren't concerned about the climate. It's that there was a pecking order. And they were more concerned, relatively speaking, about their livelihoods, about making sure that their economic interests were preserved, about affordable housing, about access to education, which are all important things. And the issue is not necessarily that people are climate skeptics and deniers in the wider public. We actually know that a lot of people believe and understand what climate change is. It's that they're thinking about perhaps the short-term ramifications of a government that so-called prioritizes climate over the economy.
Yeah.
But the two go hand in hand. And so we need to make sure that we're communicating that. And of course, we can't deny Trump's a climate skeptic. That definitely has implications on people who vote for him and who also share those views. But actually, if you speak to the majority of people, it's that they're looking for a government that has their economic interests at heart.
So, okay, but for people who do feel that urgency, right? It's obviously really stressful to see where things are headed. You see these images from LA, as we mentioned. You know things could get exponentially worse. And then we hear a 78-year-old Trump saying climate change is not our problem.
The ocean is going to go down 1/100th of an inch within the next 400 years. That's not our problem.
It might not be his problem, but it is our problem.
Yeah.
So it leads to something known as climate anxiety, which is on the rise and which is something you've written a book about. Give me a little bit of your backstory and what inspired you to write a book on this topic.
So interestingly, I had the opportunity to sail across the Atlantic back in 2018 to the UN climate conference, COP25 in Chile. And I spent a lot of time with climate activists, as you can imagine, on a boat for 3 months. We got very close. And it was a topic that kept coming up. So many people felt like they'd been pushed to despair about the climate, so much so that we thought that perhaps sailing across the Atlantic was going to remedy that, or that sailing was something that was, symbolic of taking action for the climate. And so it got me thinking about this topic quite a lot because I had read so much literature which showed that it was on the rise, that 60% of young people who were surveyed said that they found the future overwhelming and terrifying.
Yeah.
And that sort of topic kind of really resonated with me more personally as someone who is experiencing climate anxiety, but also realized that it deeply informed people's capacity to act. And I think from a practical standpoint, I kept thinking, okay, well, if this is an experience that people relate to and feel, to what extent is it going to prompt us to actually take action for the climate, or is it going to hinder it? So I wanted to explore some of those conversational topics. And naturally so, I found that the conversation was a lot more nuanced than I expected. They found that climate anxiety, when they were researching it, has the capacity to really actually drive climate action and is a very, very adaptive and rational response to what we're witnessing. On the extreme end, however, some people say that it runs the risk of being pathologized because people do fall prey to the same sort of symptoms of deep depression and anxiety, which therefore means that people are unable to act. And yeah, I think for me, it's just a topic that is only going to become more prevalent. It's only going to become a bigger issue. And I think that young people, while we are painted to be the generation that experiences it the most, it's actually all across society. And the second we start having these conversations, perhaps there's more scope and room to understand what our role is in the wider climate problem.
Yeah. So as someone who covers climate, I know you run into this problem every day. The topic is just too big and too terrifying. And at some point, people just either check out for their own sanity or they give up because it feels like a lost cause. But of course, like you said, it's not over and we need to fight for every single degree.
Yeah.
Do you have any just general advice for people who want to keep fighting but might not know what to do or how to talk about the issue with the people they care about?
I've kind of spent the last decade doing this kind of work, and I found that the thing that keeps me the most motivated is a form of accountability that I get from organizing with other people. I think creating networks of resilience are really important in times of crisis, and also these networks are the same sort of sources of energy that I draw from to do the work that I do. And whether that's people in the Global South who I work with, whose realities deeply inform my responsibility to act in favor of climate justice, or whether these are people in my local neighborhood who are trying to, advocate for a greener transition or stop polluting infrastructure or challenge the Rosebank oil field, which is an oil field in the North Sea. That's another campaign that I work on. And so I think that if you are kind of linked into a community network, that's one way to stay accountable. And it's also one way to find hope. We are so much stronger when we work together. And if we're going to talk about this practically speaking, there's scientific research that shows that communities which are closer knit, people who organize in large groups, are more able to adapt and be resilient in face of crisis. And with Los Angeles, we saw phenomenal mutual aid networks. And there's actually even scientific research that shows that people are less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder if they have that kind of community support.
Tori, thank you for coming on The Take today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's The Take. Now, we do want to hear from you. So what stories do you want to see next on the show? Let us know in the comments below what you'd like us to cover. Your feedback helps us shape future episodes, so don't be shy. Make those comments. We'll see you tomorrow.